Hello, Petal. How are you doing? How's your day? How was your weekend? Thank you all so much for the feedback for the last chapter. It was great fun. It was so much fun. I'm still smiling about it. I think it's one of my favourite chapters I've ever done out of any audiobooks on here. And I've done a lot of audiobooks that I really adore, but that's definitely got to be one of my favourite chapters that I've actually done. As ever, if you enjoy this chapter, if you could hit the like button, hit the notifications bell so you're always notified and let you know when these instant premieres go up. I think the instant premieres are actually working, just kind of like putting them up as soon as I do them, as opposed to like having them at a fixed time every day. But if you think differently, please let me know. I'm just trying to work out what works best for you lovely, lovely, lovely community and my lovely peoples and my lovely beans out there. So, yes. So, today we have chapter 8. Oh, by the way, Ellie's doing a lot better, which is good. So, chapter 8 of Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Sausages, J.W. Wells & Co., Book 7. I can't believe it. We're halfway to finishing this series. And then we'll have to start talking about which one we're going to do next. So I just put that there. Anyway, I'm going to stop waffling. Here we go. Chapter 8 of Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Sausages, J.W. Wells & Co., Book 7 by the glorious Mr. Tom Holt. Eileen, he called out. Where's my slippers? No reply. She was still in the toilet. He scowled and put on his brown shoes instead, even though they hurt his feet if he wore them for more than an hour. Then he went through to see the customer. A blouse, dry clean only, gravy stains down the front. A wool coat, ready by 5:30, he told her. She looked pleased. That was the sad irony. They offered a really quick, reliable service, as good as you'd find anywhere. By rights, they should have built up an impressive reputation by now. Except they were never anywhere long enough. All that hard work for nothing. Sometimes he wondered why they bothered. Except that if they didn't turn the stuff around inside 24 hours, there was all the fuss of getting it back to the customer. George glanced at his watch. Business had been steady, but not brisk. He hung the blouse on a hanger on the rail and made a note in the book. Eileen, he called again. No reply. 10:10. How long had she been in there anyway? She knew better than to be in the downstairs loo at 10:15. She'd be out of there in plenty of time, except he couldn't help thinking she was still in there with only 5 minutes to go. What if she'd fallen asleep or something? Hardly likely. The bell rang. A man with a grey Marks suit looked like it had been slept in. A few other mishaps that didn't want thinking about too closely. Not for him to pass judgment on the customers, of course. In his view, a dry cleaner is like a priest. He knows everything there is to know about human frailty. His job is to get rid of the stains. Hang up the suit, write it in the book. Suddenly he remembered the time. Eileen! He looked at his watch, and a cold panic spread upwards from his solar plexus, following his veins until it flooded every single part of him. He yelled her name again, then roared it. She must have heard him, so why had she not replied? Oh, God, he thought, she's in there. Neither of them had the faintest idea what took place in their downstairs toilet between 10:15 and 11:45 every day. They had more sense than to look. The strange noises, though, nearly always the same. They were so bizarre and so diverse that they offered no intelligible clue. They had never discussed it. Best not to think about it. After all, whatever it was had always stayed in there. It wasn't really any trouble. By 11:46, everything was back to normal, well, more or less. A little water spilt on the floor, a new toilet roll in the holder, and a faint smell of almonds. Not at all unpleasant. They could live with it. Not that they had any real choice. But today, as far as he could tell, it was 10:14 and Eileen was still in there, which meant he had to do something. He broke away from the counter, dashed into the back, arrived at the door and stopped it. I'm not going in there, he thought. Yes, but he had to. His wife was in there. She'd fallen asleep or had a heart attack or a stroke, and it was due to begin in a matter of seconds. He had to... His hand on the handle, he twisted it. The door was locked. It was as though he and it had a deal. You respect my space, and I'll respect yours. It was a bit like sharing a house with a polite, well-behaved werewolf. Just as long as you're out of the way at certain times, there's absolutely no reason why it can't be made to work indefinitely. But once you cross the line... Very gently, he tapped at the door. "Oh, Elaine," he whispered. Then he heard a clanking noise, which meant it had begun. He closed his eyes. For a long time, maybe 5 seconds, he stood there completely still. It was as though the universe had asked him a question, and there were 2 answers, each one completely contradicting the other. Both, he knew it intuitively, entirely true. The answers were, you have got to do something. I'm not going in there, not for anything. George had never thought of himself as a coward. He'd always assumed, on the incredibly rare occasions when it occurred to him to consider the matter, that if it came right down to it, house on fire, kiddie drowning in a pond, stuff like that, he'd probably do the right thing, because he'd have no choice. And, most likely, if the test had been one of fire or water, he'd have found the necessary courage. But it wasn't fire or water in there. Or if either fire or water were involved, he knew there'd be the least of his worries. Instead, what was in there was it. If that was cowardice, he was as yellow as a canary. End of story. Yes, he thought, but it's Eileen in there. And if something happens to her, she never comes out again. Well, he thought, it's going to be very lonely, stuck in this place forever, without anyone to talk to. Besides, there was the business to think of. He clenched his fist and banged it against the door. Ouch! Eileen. No reply, just the sound of steel being drawn across stone and a snatch of plain song. Suddenly he felt a spurt of anger, irrational, unexpected, in the circumstances exactly what he needed. Who the hell did they think they were, anyhow, taking over someone else's downstairs bog for an hour and a half every day without so much as a thank you, playing with chains and knives and singing, and no consideration for other people? Well, he thought, it was about time he put a stop to it. He wrenched the handle again, stuck solid. Now, when he'd been a kid and had gone regularly to the cinema, they used to make the sort of film where strong, admirable men regularly broke down doors. Generally, they shoulder-charged them. There was something a bit low or not quite nice about kicking them in. He considered the door. It was pretty solid. None of your 2 sheets of hardboard nailed to a deal frame when they built this house. Maybe, if he got a bit of wire, he could fiddle about and try and work the latch. No time for that. In the films, they took a bit of a run-up, then straight at it, and the next thing you saw was the hero bursting into the previously inaccessible room, his good side always facing the camera. It was one of the things where you've seen it done 1,000 times, but never really picked up the details of technique you actually need in order to be able to do it yourself. Oh well, he thought, it's hardly rocket science. He paced off 5 yards, broke into a gentle trot, walloped into the door and bounced off, howling with pain. Clearly, more to it than that. Rubbing his shoulder, his arm had gone a bit numb, he retreated to the start of his run-up and tried to analyse the problem sensibly. Kicking it was a non-starter. He established that very quickly, just as well, in fact, that he was wearing his brown shoes and not his slippers, or he'd have a broken toe to contend with as well as everything else. So what else did the heroes in the movies do? Well, if they were policemen, they shut off the lock. But he wasn't a policeman and he didn't have a gun, so that was out the window straight away. What else? In Robin Hood films, he'd known them to batter down doors with benches. That, however, was strictly a 2-man job. Slowly it dawned on him that, after a lifetime of subconsciously believing in the movies, he'd reached a sort of anti-road Damascus moment, and his faith was gone forever. In which case, He'd have to get by with just plain common sense and basic engineering. He thought, all right, what would a professional do? A burglar, say. Easy. Burglars had jemmies. They carried them, presumably, in their bags marked swag. Needless to say, he didn't have a jemmy. He wasn't even sure he'd recognised one if he saw one, let alone know how to use it. But the principle was quite simple, and he did have a long, stout screwdriver and a hammer. As he closed the lid of his toolbox, he checked his watch again. 21 minutes past 10. She'd been in there for 6 minutes already. With it. Furious with himself, he charged back to the door, located the screwdriver blade as close as he could get to the point where the latch entered the mortise, and started bashing away with the hammer. Turned out to be a piece of cake. Once the blade was in, he leaned his hip against the screwdriver handle and the door just popped open. Eileen was sitting on the toilet, unharmed as far as he could tell, an unopened magazine in her lap. She didn't look round as he came crashing through the door, and when he called out her name, she answered, "Shh." He opened his mouth defiantly, but then he followed her line of sight and his tongue froze, leaving him standing perfectly still and deathly quiet, like a statue, stiller even than a statue, as still as one of those whitened-faced mimes who stand around pretending to be statues, and you can't get much stiller or quieter than that. Where the back wall should have been, there was landscape, loads of it, rolling downland, undulating away as far as the eye could see. More or less centre, about where the toilet roll holder used to be, he saw an old, fallen down sort of a building, yellow stone with a grey slate roof and a distinctly churchy sort of air to it, though it was a bit small and didn't have a spire or anything like that. Bigger than a shed, smaller than a house, very old-fashioned and quaint. The most remarkable thing about it was that nobody had converted it into a tea shop. "Eileen," he heard himself whisper, "what's happened to our wall?" "Shh." And he could see her point. Standing in front of the building's massive nail-studded oak door was a knight in armour, shiny but black, which covered him from head to toe. Now, George wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but he was fairly sure the knight wasn't a stray customer who'd taken a wrong turning, even though his clothes were most definitely dry clean only. "What's he hissed, but Eileen glowered at him, and he subsided, just in time to see another knight striding around the corner of the building. The newcomer was fully armoured too, but his steelwear was mirror bright and gleaming, and he was leading a Purcell white horse by the bridle. If this was anything at all like the movies, and George had just seen how valuable they could be, Mr. Sparkles here had to be the hero. The horse alone practically guaranteed it. None of which explained what either of them thought he was doing, trespassing in someone else's unnaturally distended bog. With a shrill grating noise, so that's what it is, he thought, the Black Knight drew his sword and waggled it, supposed to be threatening, presumably, but George thought he could put his eye out with that thing if he's not careful. The White Knight, however, responded at once by drawing his own sword, and a moment later they were bashing at each other like panel beaters. It can't have been something either of them had said, because not a word had been spoken, but it was fairly obvious they didn't like each other very much. On the other hand, thanks to all the sheet metal, neither of them seemed the slightest bit affected by the clobbering he was getting. It all reminded George a bit of Juge en Francières, except that they were using swords instead of water-filled balloons. Then, for no obvious reason, the Black Knight suddenly keeled over and landed on his back, flop, making the floor shake and the toothbrushes rattle in their mug. Without knowing the rules, it was hard to know precisely what had been achieved, but the White Knight stepped back and sheathed his sword in a "let that be a lesson to you" manner, so presumably he had won. Quick glance at watch. All that had only taken 5 minutes, which meant an hour and 20 minutes still to go. "Here," Eileen muttered. "Do you think he's all right, the one lying down? Maybe we should call an ambulance." His turn. Shh. Yes, but if anything happens to him, what'll it do to our insurance? Valid point, made irrelevant by the disappearance into thin air of the Black Knight. The White Knight either hadn't noticed or thought nothing of it. He was standing in front of the door, belting it with his clenched fist. 3 massive thuds, and the door was opened by a monk in a hoodie. Cowl, who beckoned to the knight in slow motion, whereupon they were inside the building, which was a bit disconcerting. The walls were pale grey stone, the roof was high and vaulted, and directly ahead was a church altar. Last time he'd been this close to one of them, he'd been saying "I do," while Eileen's mum's eyes had been blistering the back of his neck. The parallel comforted him rather. That had seemed strange and disconcerting at the time, but it hadn't turned out too badly. It's all just it, he told himself. It doesn't matter, as long as we can get away from it, which we can do at any time, just by running to the toilet door. With that reassurance firmly in mind, he admitted to himself that he wouldn't mind finding out what was going to happen next. The monk led the knight to the altar and pointed at it, then bowed low and backed away. George took his eye off him for a moment, and then the monk wasn't there any more. Now, that didn't seem to matter. The knight went down on one knee as if proposing. Somewhere off stage, a choir started singing monk song. The knight clasped his hands together in prayer. Eileen suddenly gasped as in pain. "What?" he whispered. "Pins and needles," she replied, and rubbed her leg. Gradually, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, the altar began to glow. The unseen choir hit a high note and held it. The glow was now too bright to look at comfortably. Bloody hell, he thought. Steven Spielberg in our downstairs toilet. And he looked away. Then the playing song stopped, and he looked up. The altar had stopped glowing. The knight, who turned away to avoid the glare, started to get up and then froze, then dropped down on both knees with a creak of straining rivets. George felt a stiff breeze on his face, in his hair. A cloud of dust was slowly rising from the altar, swirling, forming a double helix. Definitely Spielberg, he thought, and then the helices collapsed, and there, on the altar, sitting next to each other, were a chicken and an egg. He stared at them, and then movement from the knight caught his eye. The knight had jumped up as if starting a race, and then he stopped, paralysed. Then he raised his right hand, balled his fist, and crushed it with terrible force against his armoured thigh and yelled, not with pain, but desperate frustration and despair. The vaulted roof caught his yell and played tennis with it, backwards and forwards from wall to wall, and that set the choir off again, chanting their slow, measured harmonies. The knight lunged at the altar, whereupon the chicken and the egg both vanished. The knight stopped dead in his tracks. They reappeared, and he took another step. They vanished, and he juddered to a halt. The knight sank to his knees again, mourning softly, and this time George could just about make out the words. "Which came first?" the knight whimpered. "Which came first?" Then the whole toilet shook as a great voice that seemed to draw its power from the very stones boomed out in perfectly modulated quadraphonic sound. "You are not worthy. Go and never return." The knight bowed his head, stood for a long time as if unable or unwilling to move, then turned on his heel and walked slowly out of the chapel. Outside again. No sign of the White Knight, but the Black Knight was back on duty in front of the chapel door. "Oh, he's all right then," Eileen muttered. "I was a bit concerned." The White Knight appeared around the corner of the chapel, leading his horse. That was it. "Come on," he hissed, grabbing Eileen by the wrist. "Let's get out of here." "But I want—" "Come on," he repeated, and towed her after him towards the door, the real one, which he'd forced open with a screwdriver less than 15 minutes ago. But there didn't seem to be any sign of his onslaught now. There wasn't a mark on it, and it was firmly shut. He reached for the handle and wrenched at it. It came off in his hand. Behind them the two knights were at it again, crash, bang, wallop like a car smash or a breaker's yard. George stood quite still, looking at the plain brass doorknob in his hand, with two screws still in their holes in the mounting plate, and a shadow fell across him. Then he turned to find he was looking into the gentle grey eyes of the monk, who shook his head sadly and said, "You can't leave. I am sorry." He was about to shout, quite probably something nasty, but Eileen beat him to it. She looked at the monk and asked quietly, "So which did come first?" The monk shook his head again, and the folds of his cowl flapped like an elephant's ears. "I'm sorry," he repeated. For some reason, that made George really very angry. "Look you," he growled. "My wife just asked you a civil question." The monk sighed softly. "That information is not available. Also, you're standing on my foot." "What? Oh, sorry." He stepped back quickly, and the monk smiled. "Thank you," he said. "We apologize for any inconvenience. If you have further queries, say stop. If you would like to return to the chapel, say stop. If you would like to leave the room and return to your normal environment, stop. That function is not available at this time," the monk said smoothly. "Please try later. If you have further queries." Now, under normal circumstances, George wasn't a violent man. In fact, the last time he'd hit someone, it'd been about a disputed conkers match, and Harold Macmillan had been Prime Minister. He clenched his right fist and swung it at the monk's face, which turned to mist and faded away. "You shouldn't have done that," Eileen said. "You're not helping." In the background, bloody playing song again. "I want to go back in," Eileen said. "I want to find out what happens." Now that made him shudder. Got to get out of there. The question was how. Breaking down the door, been there, done that. On this side, however, the door opened inwards. Come on, he thought. This isn't the first time in the history of the world someone's got stuck in a toilet. He considered the handle, but the bit of square section bar the handle fits over had vanished from the door, so just putting the handle assembly back on wasn't going to solve anything. "Come on." Eileen was tugging at his sleeve. "I want to know which came first." "Don't be stupid, it's just a kid's riddle," he said, and as he said it, he knew he was lying. "There's no answer, that's the whole point." Maybe there was something in the chapel he could use instead of the square bar, a bit of wood, a window say, or what about the point of the knight's sword? All he had to do was make the turny thing in the lock turn 90 degrees, and they could be out of there, safe, gone. Oh, if only he still had his Boy Scout penknife. "Idiot," he said aloud, and dropped to his hands and knees. It had to be there somewhere. True, things vanished into thin air around here, but not, he was prepared to bet, stuff that had been brought in from outside. There were rules. There had to be. Say what you like about it. There had always been rules, and they had always been complied with. He felt something under his foot, stooped down and found what he'd been looking for, the screwdriver he'd used to jemmy the door. It was a wonderful moment, like finding yourself in a foreign city and hearing an English voice. He straightened up, stuck the blade of the screwdriver into the hole in the lock where the square section bar should have been, and turned. The door opened. He grabbed it and pulled it wide open. Beyond the threshold, one small step, was the worn carpet of his downstairs back corridor, every frayed edge and tea-stain as precious to him as life itself. The playing song had stopped. Round about now the great voice was presumably telling the White Knight to go away, which meant that any moment now the whole process would start again. He turned around to collect Eileen and saw to his horror that she'd got up from the toilet seat and was trotting determinedly towards the chapel door. "Bloody woman," he breathed softly to himself. As quickly as he could. He jammed the screwdriver wedge fashion under the bottom edge of the door, then sprang after her and grabbed her arm. "Let go," she snapped. "I want to see." "Not now," he barked at her. 30 years and never a cross word. "Come on, I've got the door open. Please, it's not safe." She was looking at him like he was simple or something. "Don't talk daft," she said, as to a small, timid child. "There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just a—" She frowned, trying to find the right word. "It isn't really real," she said. "It's more like a recording or something. They can't hurt us because they're not really here." He could see where she was coming from, but there was a lethal flaw in her reasoning. He knew it was there, but he couldn't think clearly enough to pinpoint what it actually was. Briefly, he considered knocking her out and carrying her through the door over his shoulder, but then he thought about his back and, being a realist, decided against it. But if the caveman approach wasn't viable, what was he supposed to do? "Eileen," he said, "I'm ordering you to." Now, she was not listening. The Black Knight had reappeared outside the chapel door, and she was heading straight at him. "Eileen." Then far away, but quite distinct, he heard the ding of the shop bell. She heard it too, and for a moment she stood quite still, like a comet exactly halfway between two black holes. Then she turned round, smart as a soldier on parade, and hurried past him, through the door and into the corridor. He closed his eyes, let go of a breath he'd been holding for rather longer than was good for him, and started after her, only to be intercepted by the monk, who was smiling pleasantly and holding a long-bladed screwdriver. "That's a deal, is it?" he said to the monk. "She can go, but I've got to stay." The monk shook his head. "Nothing like that," he said. "Good. And get out of my way." The monk stepped aside. "Your screwdriver," he said. "Thanks. You're welcome." Just having the screwdriver back in his hand made him feel noticeably more secure. "All right," he said. "What do you want?" The monk shrugged. "The time is drawing near," he said, "and you have been found worthy. Have a nice day." "Worthy of what?" he demanded, but he got no answer. Instead, the monk pushed him out through the door and slammed it shut. The alarm clock trilled, waking Mary Byron out of a most peculiar dream, in which she'd been a chicken of all things. As she opened her eyes, it remained so vivid that she had to shake her head to get rid of it. Shower, dress, breakfast, toast and black coffee, then half an hour being chewed up by the Northern Line, then work. She sat down at her desk and opened her diary to see what treats lay in store for her. "Help," in big red letters. She frowned. The bizarre, poultry-haunted dream hadn't been the only disturbing thing lately. Far from it. For one thing, she had a nasty suspicion she had an admirer, or something equivalently creepy. It started small. Cups of coffee left for her on her desk when she came back from meetings or trips to the loo. Difficult bits of work done for her in her absence. The latter narrowed down the list of likely suspects to the other solicitors in the office, and the thought of any of them fancying her made her skin crawl. Without proof, however, she couldn't very well start firing out accusations or go to Mr. Huss with a formal harassment complaint, and so far her attempts at amateur sleuthing had gotten nowhere. When her unseen helper had sorted out the Attractive Avenue file, for example, all the possible suspects had had watertight alibis, vouched for by secretaries, office juniors, reception and similarly unimpeachable witnesses, and she had been forced to admit that she had absolutely nothing to go on. Now that didn't help. The thought that her secret stalker was rational enough and cunning enough to cover his tracks so well was hardly encouraging. It was so bad, she'd even contemplated chucking the job in, though not for long, given the depressed state of the conveyancing sector. Now, apparently, whoever it was had gone a little bit further off the rails and had started writing pleading messages in her diary. It had to stop, she decided. As always, the day's incoming mail was in a wire tray on the left-hand side of her desk. She leafed through it, a preliminary reconnaissance only, triage rather than OR. Nothing much. None of the outstanding items she was waiting for to wrap up ongoing cases. She opened her drawer and groped for the box of paper clips. Found it. Found it empty. She sighed. That was another annoying thing. Not nearly as bad as the stalker, but over time it was really wearing her down. Of course, it was part of office life, the constant, trivial pilfering of stationery from colleagues' desk when the store cupboard was bare or one simply couldn't be bothered to walk up 3 flights of stairs for a pencil sharpener or a refill of staples. But it was getting, so you couldn't leave anything for 5 minutes and be sure it'd be there when you got back. And when she thought of all the time she was having to waste, traipsing backwards and forwards to the storeroom because some thoughtless individual had robbed her of basic supplies, the phone rang. It was only Martin. "What do you want?" she snapped, rather more harshly than she'd intended.
"Sorry,"
her brother replied.
"Bad day?"
"What do you want?" she repeated.
"It's a bit awkward. You see..."
She clicked her tongue. Words weren't needed when he used that tone of voice. "You're after money again," she said.
"You make it sound so..."
He stopped and started again.
"It's only 50 quid,
he said,
to tide me over until..."
"For crying out loud, Martin!"
"I'll pay you back on Thursday, I promise you. Only I still haven't got paid for the Hanwell gig, and I'd been sort of counting on that for the rent."
She sighed. "You know what?" she said. "I'm getting a bit fed up with being a patron of the arts. It was all right for the Medici and the Esterházys. They had the money. Besides, they got something to show for it. You, on the other hand..."
"Yes, all right. I know I'm wasting my life, and why don't I get a proper job? Actually, I think I'm on the brink of getting into something really good. I'm meeting this bloke next week, and..."
"Martin..."
"Good,"
he said firmly.
"as in lots of money, composing, well, writing jingles actually, for commercials and radio stations. It's crazy what they'll pay for just 7 notes, provided they're the right ones."
"Martin," she said grimly, "if I agree to lend you £50, will you promise me you'll spend a fiver of it on a dictionary so you can look up proper and job, because I don't think you quite grasp..."
"Forget it then,"
Martin said crisply.
"Sorry I bothered you. I quite understand. Have a nice day."
Click, buzz. She scowled furiously at the receiver, then slammed it back on its cradle. It was so bitterly unfair, she thought, how Martin had the knack of zooming past her and up the snow-capped peaks of the moral high ground, when by any relevant criteria he was a sponger, a wastrel, and an inefficient use of the increasingly scarce resources. It wasn't as though she begrudged him the money. He'd be welcome to it, if only he had the grace to cringe and grovel for it occasionally. Her eye fell on the diary, still open in front of her, still broadcasting a big red help. Now, the silly thing was, she had a vague memory of a dream in which she'd been asleep and dreaming, and in her dream there'd been someone else sitting at her desk, writing in her diary, and maybe the pen she'd used had had a red cap. Coincidence or déjà vu? There was a scientific explanation for that. She'd heard something on the radio. There was always a scientific explanation. Unfortunately, she'd given up on science as soon as she'd had the option, a decision she'd regretted ever since. Instead, she'd set her heart on being a lawyer in a smart suit, sitting at a desk, in control, like the captain of a starship. One of the bitterest things about her life was that she'd always achieved her ambitions to the full. She'd give it half an hour, she decided, and then she'd call Martin back and tell him he could have his rotten 50 quid. It wouldn't be enough to regain as much as a moral foothill, but at least they'd be on speaking terms again. Besides, she thought, if he's really got a chance to go into the jingles business, there was a possibility she might be reunited with her money one of these days, in the coming by and by. Like he'd said, it was crazy what some people would pay for a jingle, or so she'd heard. She opened the next file on her heap and reset her mind to work mode. There was a lot to do today, a great many important things requiring her undivided concentration. These standard form requisitions on title, for example. Like a small boat adrift on a turbulent sea, her mind floated away. A chicken, for crying out loud, as in no spring. Well, she couldn't deny that, and maybe that was all there was to it, as in, why did the chicken cross the road? Now, someone had said that quite recently, and in context it had seemed important. Supposedly, according to the latest research, that and the door that's ajar were the two best-known jokes in the English language. Odd that, since neither of them was particularly funny. The door thing was at least a rudimentary pun, but the chicken gag was just silly, meaningless, like a nursery rhyme. The only way she could think of in which it could carry any vestigial charge of humour was if it was shorthand, a prompt, the tip of an iceberg, serving to remind the listener of the rest of the joke, long since lost and forgotten. Otherwise, there was no possible excuse for it. In which case, who'd said it to her just lately, and why had it been so important that she remembered it? Well, enough of that. She shooed all the chickens from her mind and filled in some land registry forms, an exercise that left her feeling thirsty and caffeine deficient. So she went to the kitchen and made herself a nice strong coffee. Black, no sugar. When she got back to her desk, something was different. She scowled, put her mug down on the top of the filing cabinet and investigated. Someone had closed her diary. That was all. Nothing more. She opened it, found today's date and put it down in its usual place. Nothing else appeared to have been touched, which was something. Even so, she was furious. Someone had come in the moment her back was turned, did that imply her movements were being watched, and had read her diary, presumably to try and get an advance notice of any trips out of the office, personal appointments, whatever. That was a new level of creepiness, and she wasn't prepared to put up with it. Not making a fuss was all very well, but there were limits, which in her view had just been exceeded. She picked up a phone and rang through to Pauline, Mr. Huss's PA. "Can I see him for a couple of minutes?" she asked. "It's important." Now, getting past Pauline was usually on a par with sneaking backstage at a Springsteen gig. Today, however, Pauline chirped back. "Will today at 11 be all right?" Mary glanced at the clock on her wall. It was 10:45. Sure," she replied, slightly stunned, "if that's okay with him. I don't want to—" "You did say it was important." And yes, damn it, it was. 11 sharp then, she said, and put the phone down. Then the shakes set in. Evidence, for crying out loud. She didn't have any. Well, there was the coffee, but she could hardly go charging into Mr. Horse's actual office with an empty mug in her hand and expect to be taken seriously. The work done for her. Thin, perilously thin. The diary, she thought. That, at least, is a physical object I can put in front of him. There it was. Help. Big red letters. And big green letters. She stared at it for a moment. Help. A fairly useless message because it's so vague. A bit like, "Look out," suddenly yelled in your ear by your front seat passenger. Also, the handwriting was different, though, given the degree of cunning displayed so far by her tormentor, there wasn't anything surprising in that. Well, she thought, that's evidence. Nobody could look at that and deny that I had a case to put before an industrial tribunal. If she chose to go down that route, that is. Not that she had any reason to believe that Mr. Huss wouldn't be as shocked and appalled as she was. Another glance at the clock. Might as well make a move. It was a long way to Mr. Huss's office, even when the lifts were running okay. Tucking the diary under her arm, she walked briskly up the corridor, past the printer room and the small interview room and the closed file store, left at Denny Brock's room, along more corridor, then sharp right and directly into the lift, which was waiting for her with its door conveniently open. She pressed the button for the 7th floor and the door closed with a soft whoosh. The lift went straight up from 3 to 7. The door opened. Mr. Huss was in his office expecting her. He was very kind and sympathetic, and assured her that he'd look into it straight away. He went as far as to write something down on the back of a blue folder. Even so, Polly got the distinct feeling that his mind was elsewhere. Polly took the lift back to the 3rd floor. Preoccupied with her recent encounter, she didn't look down, which was probably just as well. If she had, she couldn't have helped noticing the stray wisps of straw, the 4 light brown feathers, and the still warm egg. Mr. Goggerty stared at the smoking ruins and wept. 12 fire engines were battling the fire, which was still roaring away in outlying parts of the building. They weren't having much luck. Water didn't seem to have much effect, especially on the bright green flames welling up out of what looked like a perfectly ordinary toilet bowl on the 2nd floor. Depending on the water pressure and the angle from which the jets were directed, the flames either rose up higher or doubled their heat output or played selections from Phantom of the Opera. The original cast recording. Fire-suppressant foam turned the fire purple with a faint green pinstripe, and worried-looking men in bulky orange suits were muttering to each other about blowing the remains of the building up with dynamite. It was just as well Mr. Goggerty overheard them. He slid through the crowd, ducked under the incident tape, reassured the policeman with a serious nod, and joined the discussion. "Goggerty," he said, "head of operations, MP3, whatever you do, don't use explosives. Not," he added with a wild grin, "unless you really want to annoy the Ordnance Survey." An orange suit turned to him. "Do what?" "All those maps they'll have to redraw," Mr. Goggerty explained. "Look, just tell your men to turn off the taps and back off. I'll deal with it." Which he did, by taking a small packet of white powder from his top pocket and tossing it into the heart of the fire, which immediately went out. In fact, the powder was coffee sweetener, but Mr. Goggerty reckoned that if he'd just given the fire a stern look and said, "Behave," to the 4 overexcited salamanders who'd broken out of the aquarium and were causing all the fuss, he'd have drawn unwelcome attention to himself. Instead, he explained that the powder was just the latest oxygen extraction reagent, a sample he'd liberated on a recent visit to NASA. "What started it?" he asked. They had no idea, though they weren't ruling out arson at this stage. Why not? Because they hadn't been able to get close enough to rule out anything, from an electrical fault to a flypast by masked dragons. "Fair enough," he replied. "Well, I won't keep you. Make sure there's a report on my desk by 0900 tomorrow." On his way back through the cordon, he scooped up the salamanders, who were drooping about on the pavement looking lost and sad, and stored them safely in his 100% fireproof jacket pocket, on the principle that things were bad enough without 4 emotionally disturbed invisible fire spirits wandering about the capital. Their names, they told him, were Pinky, Perky, Boris and Patch. He promised to find them a new home as soon as he could, and they curled up and went to sleep. He took a taxi to Blue Remembered Hills and asked to see Mr. Horse. He found him sitting at his desk, holding a brown chicken feather in one hand and an egg in the other, looking distinctly worried. "Things are getting bad," Mr. Horse said. Mr. Goggerty registered polite concern. "Business, you mean?" he asked. "Or the other thing?" Mr. Horse put the egg carefully in his empty coffee cup. "Both," he replied. "I'm having to lay off staff, and that's not as easy as you might think either. In fact, I'm not sure how much longer I'll be able to. Anyway, how about you? Progress?" Mr. Goggerty frowned. "Developments," he amended. "The thing is about investigations in my field," he went on, "it's all a game of snakes and ladders." With real snakes, he didn't add, sometimes 100-headed, and as for ladders, even he didn't want to know. You make what looks like a breakthrough and then suddenly you hit a brick wall. But then, if you can get past that, you'll probably find there's been another breakthrough. I won't bother you with the details." "Oh." "Suffice to say," Mr. Goggerty went on, "as far as I'm concerned, this case has just got personal. Something very important to me. Well, anyway." He sat up a little straighter and steepled his fingers in front of him. "I wanted to ask you, have you told anybody else about what we were talking about yesterday?" Mr. Horse grinned. "Are you serious?" "That's a no." "Too bloody right. When I was telling you about it, it all sounded so crazy it made me wonder if I was off my head. If some of the people I do business with ever found out.
Quite, Mr. Gockety said. I just wanted to make sure there hadn't been a security breach at this end.
Rest assured,
Mr. Horse said grimly.
So, now what?
I still have a very promising lead, Mr. Gockety replied, which I'm just about to follow up. I'll let you know as soon as I've got anything.
Mr. Horse nodded.
So, no sneak preview?
No.
Tiny little hint? Cryptic clue?
No.
Oh.
Mr. Horse pulled a face, then shrugged.
For fear of compromising security, I suppose.
Partly,
Mr. Gockety said, rising to leave.
Also, you probably think I'm crazy.
The Carpenter Library wasn't the only place that had the definitive edition of the Yellow Pages. There was one other copy.
Sort of.
Mr. Gockety took a taxi to Marylebone Station, a train to High Wycombe, and a minicab to a small private airfield about 6 miles out of the town, where he was well enough known to be able to hire a helicopter at 10 minutes' notice. The pilot assigned to him was a short, square man with bright blue eyes and no neck.
"Where to?"
he asked. Mr. Gockety handed him a piece of paper with a map reference. The pilot nodded.
"You want to land, or
No.
just buzz around a couple of times, that sort of thing?"
I'll tell you what to do when we get there.
It was a fast, modern helicopter, bless Mr. Horse and his unlimited, unqueried expenses, and the flight only took an hour, during which time Mr. Gockety sat quietly in the passenger seat doing sums on a calculator with 3 side-by-side screens. When the pilot said,
"We're here. Now what?"
he looked across at the instrument panel.
Which of these is the altitude?
He said.
"That one."
Mr. Gockety looked at the readout, then down at his calculator.
Up another 76 metres, he said.
76? The pilot grinned. "You're sure you don't mean 76.395?
That's all right,
Mr. Gockety said.
I've got long legs.
When the altitude readout was as close as he felt he was going to get, Mr. Gockety checked his calculator again.
Hold this altitude, he said, and move 3 metres starboard.
The pilot shrugged.
"Tricky,"
he said. Mr. Gockety gave him a look he remembered for many years to come.
Give it your best shot,
he said. The pilot swung round in a shallow loop and tried again.
"There,"
he said.
"Close enough for you."
I hope so,
Mr. Gockety said.
Right, just wait here, I won't be very long.
Before the pilot could stop him, Mr. Gockety had unbuckled his safety harness, opened his door and stepped out of the helicopter. For a split second, his left foot groped cloud, then it came to rest on something invisible, but solid, and Mr. Gockety shifted his weight onto it, as with his right hand he appeared to knock 3 times on a faint wisp of water vapour. A door opened. The pilot tried to peer past him to see what was beyond it, but could not. Then the door closed. A moment later the pilot, who hadn't been paying proper attention to the controls, flew straight through the exact spot where it had been, and just as well really that there was nothing there.
"Stan!"
The old man who had opened the door grinned broadly and clapped Mr. Gockety on the shoulder.
"Wonderful to see you. It's been such a long time."
Mr. Gockety looked down at the mangy carpet under his feet, then across at the dingy, nicotine-streaked wood chip on the walls.
Everything here seems pretty much the same, he said. I thought you were going to redecorate.
"I did."
The old man sounded hurt.
"Don't you like it?"
On the mantelpiece at the far end of the room, Mr. Gockety noted a faded chrysanthemum in a jam jar. Last time, as he recalled, it had been a faded rose.
Love what you've done with the place,
he said.
"Well, don't just stand there,"
the old man said.
"Come in, sit down. Let me get you something. A coffee? Tea?"
2 grubby-looking mugs had materialised on a dusty table. A plate of digestive biscuits landed on the edge of the table, wobbled and fell on the floor.
"You're looking really well, Stan. Really well. And doing all right for yourself, so everybody's saying."
Mr. Gockety perched on a rickety chair, which swayed under him.
Not so bad, he replied, ever since.
"And your mother?"
the old man went on.
"How's she doing?"
Oh, fine.
"And your Aunt Priscilla?"
Fine, fine.
And your cousin Mary? Fine. And your second cousin Daryl? He's at medical school, isn't he?
That's right, Mr. Gockety said grimly, and he's fine.
That's grand.
The old man said, picking up the biscuits off the floor and dusting them on his cuff.
You be sure to give my regards to your mother. She must be very proud of you.
Mr. Gockety shuffled a little on the pinnacle of the seat. I'll do that, he said. What I wanted...
You heard about the Carpenter Library?
The old man's crinkled face became terribly grave.
Wasn't that a dreadful thing?
I was there this morning, Mr. Gockety said. That's one of the reasons...
Burn to the ground!
The old man went on, shaking his head sadly, and a light from the bare bulb danced on the shiny earpicks of his bald head.
Oh, those wonderful books! Oh, gone! Irreplaceable, most of them. Makes you wonder who do such a thing.
Yes, Mr. Gockety said, so firmly that the old man looked up, as though he'd just remembered Mr. Gockety was there. Like I was saying, he continued, that's one of the reasons I'm here. The old man nodded.
Not just a social call, then?
No.
Drink your tea. It's getting cold.
The old man folded his hands in his lap and sighed.
Just think of it,
he said.
The Carpenter Library, gone forever. I used to spend hours in there when I was studying for my exams.
Which would have been 60 years ago at least, and the Carpenter had only been built for 15, but it was that sort of library. Me too, Mr. Gockety said. I'll miss the place, that's for sure, but...
You'll be wanting to use upstairs then?
The old man was looking straight at him, and Mr. Gockety had forgotten how bright his eyes could be when he wanted them to. He nodded. The yellow pages, he said. That's all right, isn't it? He said it lightly, as though the request was a mere formality, which it wasn't. In theory, access to the Spielman Web archive, of which the bright-eyed old man was the guardian and curator, was restricted to the most eminent leaders of the profession, and even they had to submit a written request for permission to the General Ethical Council. Just turning up and asking to see the archive could result in being shown the door, bearing in mind where the door was. It was no laughing matter. On the other hand, the curator had been to school with Mr. Gockety's mother.
Well,
the old man said,
I don't know.
Mr. Gockety crushed his pride down into his boots. Please, Uncle Theo. A long sigh.
I guess so,
the old man said.
Just mind you don't go telling anybody. You'll get me in trouble. Drink your tea.
10 minutes later, Mr. Gockety stepped out of the door in the cloud into the waiting helicopter, shut the door, waved goodbye to the shiny head floating in apparently thin air, and told the pilot to take him home. The pilot looked at him.
You just...
Mr. Gockety nodded. Yes, he said, and yes, you could tell someone, but who'd believe you? He spent the entire flight home staring at the turned-up page of his notebook, on which was written an address. From time to time, he glanced at his watch and asked the pilot if he could go a bit faster.
You're in a hurry,
the pilot said eventually. That's right, Mr. Gockety replied. Got to get to the dry cleaners before it shuts. Oh, well, things are getting a little bit quirky, aren't they? Eh? So, yes, that was an interesting one. Very much a bridge chapter. Right there. So how's your week looking? How are you doing? How are things going? Let me know in the comments, because you know we like to have a little bit banter in the comments. It's always good fun. I'll try and get you another chapter in a couple of days. But the most important thing is that you have some nice chill time and some good rest and eat some good food. And what will be the tune for the day? I'm a bit at a loose end. I'm not really sure. We'll do another mouse organ and I'll think of some more. So, we will mend it, we will fix it, we will stick it with scissors and glue. Take it easy, pedal.